Good morning, folks. I just want to talk for just a second to make sure everybody can hear me just fine. I know the fine technical people up there in the booth will get the sound about right. Everybody here okay? Great. Okay, well, good morning. I'm John Lancaster, and I'm a member of the Board of Directors of the United States Institute of Peace. And on behalf of the board, I welcome our distinguished guests. We have the first panel up here on stage, and we have Dr. Beatrice Poligny and Professor Elizabeth Stanley and Dr. Louise Diamond and Elaine Zook-Barge, and next to me, Colonel Pyatt. And then in the afternoon, we're going to have a panel on Libya, and we have the distinguished and Honorable Deputy Minister of Justice, Najem, from Libya. We have Ms. Najla El-Mangoush. We have Mr. Issam Geriani and Dr. Matthew Stanford. And so we welcome our distinguished panelists, and we thank them for being with us today. I also welcome all of our great guests and the very able members of USIP staff who are participating today. And I acknowledge Vivian O'Connor and Colette Rausch and Audrey Warren for all their hard work in bringing us together today to discuss and study this important topic. For me, this seminar is extremely important and personal. I personally have experienced and witnessed trauma and its effects. In 1967, I graduated from the University of Notre Dame, which I had attended on a naval ROTC scholarship. In addition to my academic studies, there were military courses, summers spent with the Navy and Marines. Upon graduation, I was commissioned a second lieutenant, United States Marine Corps. After 7 months of advanced combat training, I was on my way to Vietnam, where I served as an infantry platoon commander. As a 22-year-old, I was the oldest member of my platoon, which I led through almost constant succession of combat missions against a determined and tenacious enemy. Casualties were numerous and frequent. I experienced killing and maiming an enemy who really wanted nothing more than to unify his country, free it of oppression, and create a better life for his wife and children. I tried to keep the men under me and in my command alive and effective as a fighting unit. Men I was responsible for, young good boys, were disabled and died before me. I directed the destruction of villages in pursuit of Viet Cong and soldiers of the North. I witnessed torture of captured prisoners. My Marines and I raided villages in the middle of dark nights, rousting terrorized women and children and elderly from their meager huts in search of an elusive enemy. After over 5 months, I found myself in the midst of an intense nighttime battle with North Vietnamese regulars, when in a dried rice paddy, an AK-47 round pierced through my lungs, clipping my spinal column and paralyzing me for life. I awoke several days later to learn that 4 of my 32 Marines had been killed, another 18 severely wounded, and some 60 North Vietnamese families had lost husbands, brothers, and fathers. Home in the United States, Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy had been assassinated. There were anti-war demonstrations everywhere. It was June of 1968, and I, as a Marine, was part of the problem. I was traumatized. I had inflicted and knew how to inflict great trauma. For several years, I was depressed, angry, disillusioned, and almost paranoid. Imagine living in a community, a nation, where where almost everyone experienced similar trauma. What would their reality be? How would they react? Especially if they did not have the support systems I did of family and a great government veterans support system. Years later, after my own physical and emotional rehabilitation, a series of job opportunities gave me the chance to return to Vietnam. In September of 1996, I wheeled on the dike of a verdant rice paddy 5 kilometers east of Hue City, overlooking the spot where 28 years earlier, my and so many lives had been erased or forever changed. The dozens of smiling children and questioning adults around me wanted to know about me and my America. They were dirt poor. Poverty, the only initial evidence I had of the lasting effects of the trauma of the war inflicted on them and their country. 7 more trips back to Vietnam between then and the fall of 2000, and then I moved to Hanoi to take a post funded by USAID as a law, policy, and program advisor to the Vietnamese government on issues related to people with disabilities. The lasting effects of trauma from the American War, as they called it, were festering everywhere, just below the surface of a vibrant, developing nation. Thousands of hectares of land lost to productivity, transportation, and economic opportunity due to unexploded landmines, bombs, and cluster munitions. Poverty and despair that flowed from the loss of use of one's property were extremely evident. Hundreds of children and men who were continuing to be disabled and killed annually from this unexploded ordnance in either accidental encounters or attempting to salvage valuable metals. The extensive presence of Agent Orange in the environment of many areas has caused unfathomable disorders and disease. This continuing trauma has had a profound effect on the ability of many Vietnamese to function effectively in their economy and society. It was evident in their distrust, fear, poverty, resentment, and sorrow. I saw how trauma had played out in the aftermath of the war as Northern patriots and victors extracted their revenge on their Southern American sympathizing, capitalistic, imperialistic brethren, as they called them. Soldiers and supporters of the old South Vietnamese regime were interred in so-called re-education camps without any sort of due process, and they were often murdered or worked to death. People's land and businesses were summarily taken by the victorious Socialist Party of the North as they unified and solidified their country. All competition and economic incentive was lost. Poverty was rampant. What had been the world's second largest rice producer before the war had to import rice to feed its people. The collective farms and state-owned industries were failing. All of this was reinforced and exasperated by the economic sanctions imposed by the United States. The rule of law was the party strongman and corruption. Vietnam in the late 70s and early 80s was totally at the effect of trauma induced by its decades of war against the French, Americans, and themselves. In my opinion, if it had not been for millenniums of strong and positive family structures ingrained in the culture, and the long tradition of Buddhism, and the post-war support of the Soviets, Vietnam would have totally devolved as a nation. But it didn't, and I saw in the late 90s and the early 2000 decade the gradual healing of this trauma-induced ineffectiveness. The economy, societal structures, and the rule of law began to take hold after finally being initiated in the late 1980s through their process of Doi Moi. Vietnam still has a long way to go, but their positive progress is undeniable. Would a less enlightened people have fared as well? Could they have avoided almost 2 decades of lost prosperity, justice, unity, and happiness? Think of the Sudan, north and south. What is their future? The effects of trauma and what to do about it as it relates to individuals is becoming better understood and studied, more to do. Less understood is trauma's collective effects on a society, and a country, and a community. How to stop it from letting post-conflict nations devolve into anarchist, lawless, poor, despot-driven cesspools for festering further conflict and war. This is the endeavor you get to discuss today. Let the work that is done here today help avoid lost decades and further conflict in the likes of Iraq, Afghanistan, the Balkans, Chechnya, Lebanon, Palestine, Rwanda, Sri Lanka, Somalia, Uganda, East Timor, Syria, Libya, and so many other countries that have experienced conflict and trauma. There is much to study and put in practice. May today further that effort and help create peace, prosperity, and happiness. Thank you. Again, welcome. And we hope this is a very productive day.
Thank you, John, for sharing with us your wisdom and your experiences. We are very honored to have you with us here today, and on behalf of everyone, we would like to thank you for your service to our country, to the Institute of Peace, and by extension to the world at large. Thank you. We honor you.
Thank you, Chloe.
Good morning, everyone, and I wanted to thank you all for coming here in Washington, D.C. A 9 o'clock Friday morning event is a big challenge, and so just the numbers here today and the numbers that are watching through webcast are a testament to the importance of this issue and for people's understanding of how critical it is for us to understand trauma and when we engage in peace building and its effect on that process. As peace-building practitioners, as many of you undoubtedly know, we often find ourselves in places where some very horrific violence has taken place. Our work takes us to many places, geographically, and also, I'm afraid to say, emotionally. We go into conflict-affected areas with a vast wealth of knowledge, a full quiver of tools and models, the best that years of experience, study, and reflection have to offer. Yet inevitably, we find ourselves bumping up against an invisible wall, a barrier, something that is holding progress up, something that makes moving forward nearly impossible. More and more, we are finding that barrier comes from the residual, unaddressed trauma inherent in conflict. However, as we unlock the causes and effects of trauma, it is becoming crystal clear that we are opening new frontiers in addressing and possibly unraveling the web of pain and suffering that often manifests itself as conflict that we know often spans generations. I myself have worked in the rule of law field for more than 14 years, working to strengthen justice systems overseas, and during that time, I know I have come into contact with that wall. No matter how well-intentioned and how solid our plans are to help build rule of law, justice, and security for everyone, and finding lasting solutions, we know that this is never as simple as we would want. And it is in that process of trying to unravel the trauma, you inevitably take on some of it yourself. So this event was conceived with the hope that when we better understand the issues of trauma and its effect on the countries in which we work, its citizens, and on ourselves, that we can be better equipped to build peace and rule of law, both within ourselves and in the communities in which we work. Today, I am very pleased and honored to share this space with so many incredible experts whose commitment to peace and to addressing trauma is well established in their careers. We have provided the bios of each of our panelists on a handout, and also I think it's been linked to the web, so I won't go into the details of their background, but you can see the extent of their expertise. And I would like to extend a similar thanks and warm welcome to everyone here today and everyone who is joining us by webcast. Also, please help me to offer special recognition to Audrey Warren and Vivian O'Connor for their commitment and vision that made today's event possible. You will be seeing Vivian in the second half of today's event. And now I'd like for you to be introduced to Audrey, wherever she is. She's back there. And also, I would like to extend a warm welcome and thank you to my Libyan colleagues and friends. We all met when we were in Libya back in January, and it's because of them and their commitment to peace and justice and security in their countries that sparked the decision that we needed to have such an event like this when they were here. So thank you for your inspiration, your commitments to your country. In a moment, what we will do is we'll begin a very lively discussion. It's going to be very open-ended. I'm going to be sitting here and asking questions of our audience in a very informal way, and then we'll turn it over to all of you. You've been given the little note card, so please feel free to post your question. If it's directed to a certain person, just put that on there. If it's just general, that's fine too. And if you are watching by webcast, you can either email your question, or you can tweet it at USIP, and the hashtag is trauma resilience, and we will get your questions into the mix. So let's get started. Okay, I'm going to start with Elaine. What do we mean by trauma?
Thanks, Colette. If I were doing a training, I wouldn't just answer that. I would have the group do it, and I would start with an exercise, and then I would ask for metaphors like trauma is or trauma is like. Obviously, I can't do that this morning, so let me just give two words of how I usually define trauma. One is the word is wound. Trauma is like a wound. And it literally comes from the Greek word traumat, which means wound. And I find that to be a really helpful description for folks because there's a lot of similarities between physical wounds and the emotional or the trauma wounds. So for a couple examples, if I cut my arm, my body knows instinctively what to do to heal that. And I think with the emotional, or in Africa they would say the heart wounds, our body also knows what to do to heal it. If the cut is a little deeper, there are things I can learn, tools a Band-Aid or ointment that I can put on my wound to help it heal. And there are also tools and things we all can learn to help heal the heart wounds. If I break my arm, my body can't fix it, and I can't fix it. I need the doctor. And the same is true, I think, for the heart wounds. I think there are wounds that are so deep that my body can't heal, that I don't have the tools for, and I need the therapist, the counselor, the psychologist, the psychiatrist to help me heal that wound. And this is helpful for people in a lot of contexts where it helps break down that stigma, I think, of seeking help when we have the trauma wounds. The other the word that I would use is overwhelm. And this comes from Peter Levine, who says that trauma is when our ability to respond to threat is overwhelmed. And that can be an overwhelm, either physically, emotionally, spiritually, etc. And it's different for everybody. So we may go through the same, I'm going to say traumagenic event. And this is a term that was coined by David Anderson Hooker, my colleague, who says we may go through the same event. For example, Louise and I, and it may be overwhelming for her in one of those dimensions, and it may not be for me. And I think that helps us to be more open-minded and less judgmental in sort of defining what trauma is and how people should be reacting or not reacting. I think that trauma is caused by a whole lot of things. I think it's caused by violence of all kinds, whether that's natural violence, natural disasters, by humans, human violence, also by structural violence. And I think we heard some of that mentioned in the opening comments. There's a lot of trauma out there, and there's a lot of types of trauma. Some are more sort of one-time events, like an accident or a tsunami or an earthquake. Others are the ongoing cumulative traumas, which can be abuse, can be war. There's a lot of those. I'd like to just highlight 3 types of trauma that I think may be of particular interest to this group. And the one of those is secondary trauma. And again, that's been hinted at here, but secondary trauma is the trauma reactions that we can experience by simply living and being in a country that in a situation where there's a lot of violence or conflict or trauma happening, and simply witnessing it or seeing it or hearing story after story after story. We can also begin to experience some of those trauma reactions that a victim may be experiencing. On the flip side of that would be what's called PITS. This is Rachel McNair's term, which is perpetrator-induced trauma. And that literally is that those who commit the harm also experience trauma reactions, sometimes to the same extent or greater than the victims. So I think that's really an important thing to keep in mind about trauma. And last, I would just say historical trauma. And historical trauma are those traumas that happened years ago. They're often not acknowledged or addressed, and they literally get passed down through the generations. And believe me, I've now been doing this work in about 5 different continents, and every place I go, historical harms or historical trauma abound. And because of that, I mean, we literally have a lot of people walking around, a lot of communities exist with hurts and wounds that are oftentimes quite large. And I would just end by saying I think hurt people hurt people. And that means they either hurt themselves or they hurt others as a result of that. So this is a really important topic, and I'm very grateful that we're addressing it today.
Thank you, Elaine. You've defined what trauma is, and I wanted to turn to Liz and ask her, what is the effect of trauma on the individual?
Well, at its core, trauma ends up becoming a disordering of our ability to be present in the here and now. And we can end up, there's been a real revolution in the trauma field in the last 30 years with an understanding of how much of it is based at a very implicit level in our biology. And that when we experience a stressful event, from a cumulative minor stressors that were happening, so much kind of cumulative chronic stress over time can lead to a traumatic reaction, or one big event, as Elaine was talking about, can lead to a traumatic reaction. When we experience the response to stress, the fight or flight response, if our body does not have the opportunity, and our mind does not have the opportunity to fully discharge that activation that we've experienced, all of those physical sensations of arousing to deal with this threat, and all of the cognitive activity that goes along with it, when we don't have the space to recover from that fully, over time, our system gets dysregulated. And it's a spectrum. We can have minor dysregulation with small things. We can have very big dysregulation from bigger events. And when this dysregulation happens, it shows up in a variety of ways. And the symptoms can range from physiological symptoms, starting with minor nausea to full-blown gastrointestinal symptoms. We can end up, the dysregulation shows up in sort of three ways. We can end up hyper-aroused, where we get, you could say, stuck on high, where we end up with insomnia, hyperactivity, rage or panic attacks, or chronic irritability, chronic anxiety, where the system is just amped and unable to come back down. Or we can end up stuck on low, hypo-aroused, and that's when we experience symptoms like chronic fatigue, sleeping many, many, many hours and still waking up not rested, isolated from people, withdrawn, numb, and depressed. Or we can alternate between these two poles, where we have a period of time where we're very hyper-aroused and then we crash. And these symptoms show up across, as Elaine said, this whole domain: physical symptoms, cognitive symptoms, where we start having memory issues or difficulties focusing or ruminating. We can end up with spiritual symptoms, loss of belief or existential crisis or survivor guilt. We can end up with emotional symptoms where we are stuck in a particular emotional mood for many weeks or months. And we can end up with behavioral symptoms, and that is usually where people begin to see that trauma has occurred. A lot of different things that we choose to do to kind of mask and work with symptoms: substance abuse, other kinds of addictions, acting out kind of behavior, family violence, violence in the community, adrenaline-seeking behavior, where you're not okay unless you are riding your motorcycle 180 miles an hour, as is often the case with some of the troops I work with. That's kind of that they're so hyper-aroused they need that event. But as Elaine said, when we are suffering from this kind of dysregulation, either chronic stress or trauma, we are hurting, and we often end up hurting others. And so, for example, with the troops, American troops that have fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, there have been studies done with the deployed troops asking them about their behavior and downrange while they are doing the mission in these local communities. Those who have screened positive for depression or post-traumatic stress or other mental health, psychological injuries, those who've screened positive in that way are 3 times more likely to have engaged in unethical behavior while they were deployed, to report that they killed non-combatants or wounded non-combatants unnecessarily, that they've chosen to, and choosing is kind of a hard word to use there, but that they've been unable to manage the difficult symptoms that are within themselves, and they're now acting out and causing collateral damage in these local communities. And shooting dogs or kicking children or unnecessarily hurting property. And doing this has immense cyclical effects. It creates additional harm in that community. That community then does not look at these American soldiers as being there to help, and it can often push them to help the insurgents, and it sort of increases the cycle of violence. So it can have very profound personal effects, the pain and suffering here, but then it can also lead to pain and suffering in the community around.
Thank you, Liz, and that's a very good segue into your discussion of the individual, but how the impact can expand. So I'm going to turn to Beatrice to expand upon that, and how trauma can impact a collective whole.
Yeah, thank you. I would give 3 elements of answer, and the first one has been evoked a little bit already, but is that even for an individual, at an individual level, there is a very close and dynamic connection with our psychological and physical experience and our surroundings. In other words, the spiritual, the culture, the relationships. And different ways we can see that. One is looking at the narratives of survivors. In many cultures, for instance, people will describe their trauma as present in the collective body. It's not only an individual thing, it's also a collective thing. Another way to look at that is to look at the different meanings attached to trauma, which varies culture to culture. Another aspect of it is that there are very strong moral dimensions of the suffering and a lot of fundamental questions about who we are as human beings that comes with the trauma as an effect of the trauma. So, in other words, even when you look at the individual, usually we integrate them in a larger political cultural framework. We never look at the individual as individual only. I think that's an important first aspect. The second dimension that I want to mention is we have, over the last 2 decades, developed a number of transdisciplinary studies to try to understand better the mechanism that explain how we move from the individual level to the collective level, and to understand how individual trauma has collective consequences. There are 4 main mechanisms that we have found out. It doesn't mean that it's only it, but there are the 4 main that we have seen across a very large number of cases. First one, obvious, so to speak, the existence of a very large number of individuals traumatized in a society has a clear impact on how the society functions. And it goes beyond the sum of the people involved. Because if you think of, for instance, a family, just one person being traumatized in a family has impact, and you can see that with soldiers, for instance, coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, has an impact on everybody in the family. Imagine in a community, it has an impact because people start being dysfunctional in a different ways in the way they function. So it's very important. I will add to that two elements that complexify our work, so to speak, in most cases is oftentimes, and Elaine alluded to that, we have to do with complex trauma. In other words, most people have a trauma that doesn't refer only to one event, but to a succession of events, in particular in war that are lasting and in situations where the violence lasts over decades oftentimes. Think of DRC, Afghanistan, etc. The other thing is, as Ellen mentioned, it includes the perpetrator's trauma. And that's very important in societies in which we are working. The second mechanism is trauma caused by violence, and in particular interpersonal violence, has an impact on the way individuals think of themselves in relationship with the community and the society. The conception of human bonds is affected by that. And the forms and meaning of what community and society is about is affected by that. And this has a lot of consequences. The third aspect is the potential cycle of violence and trauma. And here I just want to say that there is nothing mechanic. It's not because you have been traumatized that you are going to become violent. But there is a risk. And individually it's very hard to prove, quote unquote, but for instance, that's been very thoroughly, empirically shown in the cases of female suicide bombers. For instance, it's quite astonishing. Almost all female suicide bombers happen to have been deeply traumatized by successive events. That's a clearer case, but again, there are other cases we know when this happens. The fourth mechanism is, as Elaine mentioned, the intergenerational effects of trauma, the notion of historic trauma, the fact that trauma gets passed generation to generation. Just want to add one thing here. It can be passed by silence. The narrative is not necessarily explicit, and in my experience, the case that is clearest is Cambodia. Cambodia people don't talk about things. But the trauma, the way things are passed through silence is absolutely astonishing. If I have 1 or 2 more minutes, the third aspect I want to mention is just to say, okay, so we understand there is a link. What are the consequences? What kind of impact can we see? And there are 5 main, and again, it's not exhaustive, but 5 main impacts that we have been able to document and research. First, the impact on social relations and trust. And the notion of trust is very important. We have many studies and many examples in which we see the impact on relationships in the domestic sphere and in the public sphere. When I say in the domestic sphere, the 2 main bonds that are touched usually are intergenerationals and gender. We have very, very interesting studies from that point of view in Rwanda and Sierra Leone, but also in the public sphere, relationship between groups and of different identity, the sense of a community, the sense of being able to trust each other. And here, this is where the social mechanism, the informal social mechanism of control, if you want, are weakened, and there is a higher risk of violence. Because the ways people behave in the community, because you cannot trust anybody, you no longer know what are the rules. Nothing is predictable, so it's very hard to function, and usually that means that there is more risk of violence. One expression Ellen was mentioning, metaphors. One expression that comes over and over in different languages is the sense of being lost. Very often people say, "I feel lost," because they cannot trust. The second aspect is the impact on behavioral norms. And that's usually we refer to it as cultural trauma. Just some aspect of it. Some forms of violence induce a type of trauma that has a greater impact on how people perceive norms. For instance, repetitive transgressions of taboos, sexual violence. Some specific type of violence, for instance, in Sierra Leone, the impact of having so many people amputated. What did it mean? Very symbolically, not only the fact that you have so many people no longer have arms to work, but what does it mean symbolically to cut the arms of people in the community? The targeting of cultural symbols. Guatemala and Cambodia provide very interesting examples of how culturally the fact that the culture was affected has an impact on the society. So there is that sense of the norms are no longer there, and sometimes one of the impact, and we have seen that mostly in the 80s, early 90s in Colombia and Mexico, for instance, this idea of normalization of violence. Violence become part of the daily life. It's considered. It's not that people consider, oh, that's normal in the way we'll think of the word usually, but it becomes part of life. So you have violence literally in every aspect of your life. The third impact, very clear impact we see of trauma is in the transformation of collective identities. And what I refer to here is the narratives and the collective narratives built around what we call usually chosen traumas. So you have a society in which you have a large amount of people who are traumatized. How this history is going to be mobilized, in particular by political actors, is going to have an important impact on the society. It can be positive in the sense that it creates a sense of shared history, reinforce feelings of belonging, etc. But there are risks, of course. The clearest collectively is the risk of the us versus them, and you reinforce, the categories in the society and the groups who are the victims, who are the perpetrators, black and white. It has also a lot of impact individually because the collective and the political discourse can give meaning to the individual narrative and experience, but it can also suppress it. It can also mutilate personal story. It can complicate healing processes. So the kind of political discourse that exist about what has happened is extremely important, both collectively and individually. And I will finish with the two other impact. One is the impact on state-society relationships, how institutions are viewed, how rules that govern the society are viewed, how leadership is viewed, depending on the way the leadership look at those issues of trauma. And finally, very clearly, and how the person who introduced us mentioned it very clearly about Vietnam, very strong, clear impact on the collective well-being and development. And it makes sense. I think I don't need to expand on that.
Okay, picking up your last point, Beatrice, we talked about trauma and its impact on the individual, collective, the family, society, and let's pick up on its impact with Louise on reform efforts. And could you talk a little bit about that and how trauma affects reform efforts or looking at things institutionally?
Okay, I was actually going to talk more about bigger systems, but
talk about bigger systems,
and I'll try to get reform efforts in there.
Okay.
Building on what Beatrice said so beautifully, I give you the example of 9/11 in this country. It was a traumatic event for the United States. And building on what Elaine said, what is trauma? It's when something is wounded or broken. And that something can be a self-identity. Who are we? It can be a sense of safety in the world. It can be a sense of connectedness. But something deep inside us is broken. And that happened in the United States in 9/11. And our response was the fight response. And the result of that at the bigger level of system is we went to war. And we are still fighting those wars 10 years, 12 years later. And the ramifications of that at the individual and collective level is humongous. Imagine for a moment if instead of going to war on September 12th, President Bush had said, there's something broken in our world, and that brokenness has to do with the relationship between Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. The three major religions of the world. We are all going to have to share this planet together forever. Can we launch a global dialogue to explore that, deal with the historic wounds, and see and really ask ourselves together as a planetary community, how can we live together in peace and harmony? Completely different set of systems would have been set in motion. Just imagine it for a moment. It seems like, airy-fairy or goody-goody or something, but it isn't. Imagine how profoundly our response to trauma affects larger systems. And we have many, many examples around the world of the political systems, and you touched on this, being trauma-driven. Again, I would suggest to you that the two most profound festering wounds on the planet politically today are the result of decades and decades of historical and intergenerational trauma, and that would be the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the relationship between India and Pakistan, which never healed from the partition. So what happens when there is collective trauma is that it gets translated into all of our systems. Our political system is the most obvious, but also the economic system, as John showed us so beautifully, our psychological systems, all of our institutions. I want to speak also about two other systems that we don't usually think about that are traumatized. And one is the environmental. You know, we speak of human trauma, but the earth is a living biosphere. It is a living system. It is a system of systems, a system of living systems, of which humanity is one part. We tend to think that we are apart from the earth, that it's separate from us. But in fact, we are a part of the natural world. And our behavior over not just decades, but millennia has been to literally inflict trauma on the natural world by extracting resources without giving back, by putting chemicals into the air and into the water. And just as in human systems, there's a response. And the response is the perpetuation of unintended consequences in some cases, and in some cases, people who are hurt back. When the environment is hurt, it hurts back. And so suddenly we see, for instance, as the glaciers are melting in the Himalayas, and this sounds a little far-fetched, but it isn't, because it's all interconnected. As the glaciers are melting in the Himalayas, it changes the entire... Why are the glaciers melting? Because of what we're putting into the environment, into the air, right? As the glaciers are melting, it changes the weather patterns and the river systems throughout Asia. By changing the weather patterns, it's producing, what do you call it? I don't remember what the word is. But anyway, climate disasters, okay, floods, droughts, the outflow of glacier lakes, and that affects agriculture, which affects food prices, which affects stability, which affects population, which affects health and sanitation. And so you see these systems are all interconnected. And when the trauma, the originating trauma, is perpetrated over a long period of time, it becomes systematic. And once it becomes systematized, embedded in the system, it's very hard for people to get beyond that because they think that's just the way it is. So I know we're going to get to this later, but I really want to say something else about the healing of trauma. I want to start that conversation. As Elaine said, we know how to, kind of intuitively, organically, we know how to fix some trauma, and others we need bigger tools. But I would say that my experience as a peace builder around the world is that every culture has its organic, indigenous methods of healing. And I'll just, if I may tell a story about that I find just delightful. Many, many years ago, trying to think of what conflict it was probably Sierra Leone, or I don't remember. Let's say it was Sierra Leone. It might have been Liberia. Anyway, it was after the primary fighting was over, and USAID was going around, and doing its wonderful work in the world. And the issue was, how do we reintegrate child soldiers? If you want to talk about a breaking of the social contract, there's hardly any human activity worse than the whole situation of impounding child soldiers and its impact on society for generations. So USAID was going around to the different villages and talking to the village chiefs and saying, we have these young men, they came from your village, they were required to do horrible deeds in their own families and in your community, and now they have no place to go, and can you reintegrate them back into your society, into your community? And they were talking to one village elder, and he said, well, we know how to do that. We have a ritual, we have a ceremony for that, but we can't do it. And the woman said, well, why can't you do it? And he said, well, because we don't have a white chicken. She said, I think I can provide you a white chicken. He said, yeah, but we can't do it. She said, why not? He said, well, we don't have a red ribbon. She said, I can provide you a red ribbon. If I provide you a white chicken and a red ribbon, can you do the ceremony? He says, oh, yes, we can do it. So not only did that chief do that ceremony, but they put it on the radio so that villages all around could hear the ceremony and could be reminded that they too had, if not the same ritual, had their own indigenous ceremonies that they could do to now this is a very small scale, okay? But it is, one of the things we know about systems is what we call fractals, that the patterns that we see at small scales replicate themselves at larger scales. So it's important for us to be asking ourselves, what are the ceremonies? And in the rule of law, we know what some of those are. We have Truth and Reconciliation Commissions is one, and we have a whole variety of how those happen. And I'm sure we'll have conversations about these tools later, about how do you go about healing the trauma of severe violence over time, and especially when it's intergenerational. And especially when, and again, I give you the example of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where the trauma has so affected the rule of law that international, not just at the local level, but at the level of international law, and that has affected the politics of the whole region and of this country profoundly. So you see how the systemic interactions just keep going. But the healing can be the same.
Thank you, Louise. Coming back to working through systems individuals, I wanted to now ask Walt, given the military and soldiers are often front and center in many conflicts, how does the military view that connection, and how did you, being part of the military, look to the importance of identifying trauma and dealing with that?
I've been a soldier almost my entire adult life, and I really didn't realize the effects of trauma until, I think, after 9/11 and my many years in Afghanistan and then years served in Iraq, the effect that it has. The Army studies post-traumatic stress disorder, and that's very good, but that's one part of it. We often ignore the wounds that we can't see in just about all the force. So we understand that all of us suffer from post-traumatic stress, all of us. And the trick is to keep the disorder out of it, but it also to watch what it does to us in an operational context, because it does limit us on our ability to move forward, to do the things that are required, because wars will not result in peace. They never do. Peace has to be built, and soldiers must have a part in that, at least not hinder it. And where I saw it, where it really came to me was in Afghanistan, my vehicle was completely destroyed by a bomb, and all of us walked away without a scratch. And we were fine. We were in pursuit of the enemy, but we kept pursuing the mission we were on. But the young lieutenant in charge of that mission that day he never regained himself. He could never again go down this road that we were on that day. And he was one of my best officers, and I just didn't understand what was holding him back. He constantly lived in that moment. Another one of my officers, we lost a soldier to an IED, and he physically could not use that same road again. And I remember walking in front on the road, walking in front to the very point, showing them that it's not here, it's different. We've moved forward, we have to get beyond this, but it wouldn't do it. But in other areas, they were perfectly fine, or so we thought. They were able to continue to operate. And I realized that when I had asked an Afghan friend of mine, a doctor, to come to a particular government's meeting, encouraging him to come, and he just did not want to take part of the process. He was afraid for his life. I promised him I would guard him, and showing my promise, I rode in a civilian vehicle, not my Army armored vehicle. And at the last minute, we just switched our orders of movement like we were trained to do. His vehicle with his young two sons completely blown up. Nothing was recognizable. Nothing from that vehicle was recognizable. And then I realized what those lieutenants went through. They were responsible. That secondary trauma, whatever it's labeled, I mean, I think I've been diagnosed up here in the previous discussions, but it's more than just the personal trauma that you've got to now heal yourself. It's what you now can do the next day. And if you can't pick it up and then begin to promote peace, then we're failing at our mission. So we are obligated to understand the effects of these wounds and then how we can treat soldiers to move forward. And it's beyond much more the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. It's pre-traumatic stress training. And that's what soldiers must go through, because we have ignored the pre part. We're very good medically at the post part, and our soldiers are getting the right amount of care. But these wounds we thought for so long that couldn't be seen actually are quite easy to see. We've all lived in these environments, but it's so many experiences to talk to, but it's really that inability for the soldier to move forward. In the particular event where my vehicle was destroyed, one of the sergeants on that mission was one of our best soldiers. Very strong, brave young man. It's a kind of person, if you were in a dangerous situation, you'd want beside you. 2 weeks later, we went down the similar road without the lieutenant, and there was a man in the middle of the road digging a hole, running away with what looked like a detonator device in his hand. And the sergeant, on a moving target 100 meters away, was able to shoot him. Only then to pursue him to find out it was a 12-year-old boy, and he was just clutching a little toy in his hand, just a little pot. He did all the right things according to the rules of engagement, but the outcome was terribly, terribly wrong. But that same soldier went through that field, which we then found out was also a minefield, and saved that young boy's life. He plugged that hole, and he saved that young boy's life. We evacuated him. It turned out to be a good news story. He recovered, but the news was trying to twist the story of U.S. soldiers, killing innocent civilians. But when I remember talking to a reporter, I just remember telling him, how dare you think this is about a story we want to control? This is a young man who came over here to fight the enemies of our nation, a response that may not have been the right response, but that we were sent there to do it. He didn't come here to shoot a boy, but that's what he did. But he also was able to save his life. That's war, and when you train for war and you think you know what you're going to see, the reality is far from what you think it's going to be. But we must learn how to operate in these environments if we're ever going to have peace in these areas of conflict.
Thank you, Walt. And a lot of the stories that you shared, including your own, are things that often people do not talk about. And I think particularly one could say in the military, but I would say in many contexts. We were talking earlier in the break room about how even in the peace building community or the NGO world, you just don't talk about those things. You go and you're tough, and if you talk about it, you're weak, and then you're looked at differently. So I just wanted to open up the space a little bit to build upon what Walt just started, for the panelists to just give an anecdote of a time perhaps where you realized at that moment that trauma was important. And I say that because sometimes it's important for people in all of our work. You look at the bios, it all looks very technical and everyone's degreed in a little box. That it's helpful sometimes to understand that everyone, if you're a human being living in any capacity, especially when you're doing the work that's being done, that everyone's done here, and many in the audience, that this is going to be something that you may look at different levels. So maybe we'll start with Louise and move down, and then Walt, if there's anything that you would like to add to your previous comments, we'd welcome that.
Oh, I have several. Let me pick one. To prepare myself to work as an international peace builder, I knew that I had personal issues around violence because I had experienced violence in my family. And I knew that I wouldn't be able to go into a war zone and be a peaceful presence, that I would have judgment, that I would have reaction to the violence, and that I could easily be caught up in the trauma. So I spent over a year desensitizing myself to violence. And I would read war stories and watch war movies. And, at first it was like, okay, I won't watch that scene, closing my eyes for that part of it. And gradually I would be able to watch the whole thing, and gradually I'd be interested. I got to where I was interested. And then I got to where I was like, this is kind of exciting. And I actually got to where I could feel the thrill of the kill. And what bloodlust really could feel like. And then I knew I could go anywhere because I knew that I could be a compassionate presence for anyone and everyone, because I knew that my life circumstances hadn't put me in situations like that soldier where I would where I would get to the place of acting on those feelings, but that they were possible for anyone, and not to judge anyone who got there. And that was very helpful for me. In fact, I did get secondary post-traumatic stress disorder by being in war zones and working with people who had really suffered profoundly, and we were working very closely with people, and so heard a lot of the stories and walked in the killing fields, not of Cambodia, but of Bosnia and many other places, Liberia and other places. And I could feel, aside from the stories, there's also an energetic presence of trauma. I don't know how to explain that any further than just say that we all have an energy field, and there's a collective energy field, and when there's a place of war, I'm sure you can speak to this, it holds the energy for quite a long time, actually. So I came back from a dozen years of that work and announced to the field of peace builders, I'm experiencing secondary post-traumatic stress. How about the rest of you? And this was about 10 years ago, and they said, oh, no, not us. No, we're fine. What's wrong with you? That's another story, but it's inherent in the work, as you said, and we'll talk about tools a little bit later, yeah?
Thank you, Louise. Elaine?
Yeah, I don't think I prepared or knew I was going to get into the whole trauma field, but why I'm here is because I spent most of the 80s and most of the 90s living and working in Central America. I was working with Mennonite Central Committee in development and humanitarian aid peace work. And for those of you who remember what was going on in the 80s and the 90s in El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Guatemala, that's where I learned a whole lot about trauma, both individual and collective. I also learned a whole lot about resilience. Very resilient people there. But when I returned to the U.S. in 1998, I came back wanting to write a book, Where There Is No Psychologist, because I felt like I had listened and listened to widow after widow after widow tell me their story, or listen to displaced families in camps, and I felt like I didn't have any tools except to listen. And listening is great, but I wanted more tools. I haven't written the book Where There Is No Psychologist because I found what happened is that the STAR program, the Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience program at Eastern Mennonite University, emerged after 9/11. And I basically have been involved with that program now over the last 10 years. And I continue in it because I see how helpful it is to so many individuals and organizations, just the whole trauma awareness piece of it. And I think what's really, and I knew this, I wanted every humanitarian aid worker, every peace builder, every disaster response person to have it. What's becoming clear to me now this year is that there's so many more people and professions out there that need this trauma awareness. I was just recently in Mexico at the Attorney General's office at a conference, spoke at a conference 3 weeks ago in Baja California, Mexico, and they're just saying, please, we need this kind of thing for our staff. They're dealing with situations of kidnappings, of assassinations. They need it so they can better help others, but also for themselves they need it. The same in Tunisia. In March in Tunisia, it was fascinating to me. Again, it was listening to ex-political prisoners and human rights activists talking about this very theme, and I just came away and said, both of these groups just really would benefit by some sort of trauma awareness, to be trauma informed at some level, and to be able to better work with the situations that they're in. So that's why I continue.
Thank you, Elaine. Beatrice.
Yeah, I didn't know we were in the Central and South America at the same time.
Really?
Yeah, in the 80s. But for me, it's actually started a little bit earlier, without going too far in my personal story. But the reason I started working on this is because I suffered multiple traumas as a baby and my whole childhood. And for me, it was very clear that there were a few things that were very clear at the time from a young age. One was the moral dimension of trauma, the fact that I kept my childhood trying to understand what is this world about? What are those human beings around me? And for some reason, I connected very quickly to the trauma in the world and the violence I was living, to the violence largely in the world, and I really wanted to understand what the world is about and trying to do something about that. Another thing that was very clear for me very, very early on was also the transgenerational aspect of what I was living. It was very, very clear. So, and that's just directly through different ways and weird ways, but directly informed my choice of working on violence. So I started in the 80s in Central and South America, so more and I worked more in context of political violence, so more in dictatorships. And one of the things I worked on and discovered was the relationship between perpetrator and victims, because I worked a lot on cases of torture. And so there was a very complex relationship between those two, and also realized the importance of the trauma of the perpetrator. But it was very clear for me at that point also that there was a larger impact in society. I was working also on rule of law and things like that, and for me it was clear that we had to consider the trauma in answering and in thinking about transitional justice. At that time, we didn't use that word, but that's what we were doing. Circumstances of life, more than anything else, meant that I moved quickly to wars and post-war situations, and even more to situations where there had been genocide or large, massive crimes, so Guatemala, Cambodia, Bosnia, Kosovo, DRC, etc. So hundreds of thousands of people killed, and sometimes more than 1 million. So in those situations, you just take the trauma in your face each step of your way and every day, starting with people who can't sleep. And I have insomnia, chronic insomnia because of trauma, so I know how it looks somebody who cannot sleep and what it means in the difficulty to function on a daily basis. So if you have tons of people who have trouble sleeping and can't function normally during their day, there is a collective impact. The same way I've been very sensitized very quickly to the fact that many people who had been at the forefront of the resistance, for instance, during the war, during the transition, so leaders of civil society, my partners, people who was my colleagues, would, a few years later, and there are cycles in trauma, so sometimes it's a year later, sometimes it's 10 years later, developing cancers, big depressions, huge burnout. I burned out a few years ago, by the way. So, which becomes a real problem, and which you may find in Libya also too. It may mean that right at the time when you need those leaders, and they may be in the government, they may be in the civil society, and we need those people who are at the forefront of the fight, they are going to crash, or they may crash, let's say. But sometimes, for instance, in Bosnia, at some point, I remember 1 year, everybody was sick, so they were no longer there. So that has a collective impact too, and those are details, so to speak, but that are important. That means we need to integrate that and take that into account. So those are some of the things that I realized, and just another aspect, and I'm being more impressionist here, more than systematic, but another aspect is, I don't know how many times, and I couldn't understand those questions because, as I said, I had them as a kid, how many times people came to me and say, Beatrice, are we still humans? Do you think we are still humans because of what we are doing? Do you think we're still part of humanity? What's going on to us? What can you tell us what's happening? And usually I say, well, don't worry, we are all the same. That's what makes us humans. But those very fundamental questions of who am I? Who are we? How are we going to be able to function as a community, as a society? Has very strong impact when you work on elections, constitutions, reform of justice, everything. How often I have told to my colleagues, okay, we're going to organize the first elections. Have you thought about what it means for those people to be citizens? What does it mean to be a citizen in that society when there is absence of trust, when we can't trust each other, when it's so difficult to trust and people are so traumatized and asking themselves, who am I, even as a human being? So for me, I have very, very concretely touched very often those intangible dimensions of what we do. What is behind justice? What is behind building a new political or reimagining a political community? What is behind everything we do? Those substantial things. trauma directly informs that, has an impact of who we are and who we are in relation to others. Passing to you.
Liz.
I know of trauma from personal experience as well. I'm 9th generation U.S. Army. There's been a Stanley fighting in the U.S. Army since the Revolutionary War. And my grandfather fought in the Pacific in World War II and then in Korea. My father did multiple tours in Vietnam. And so I grew up surrounded in an environment where these effects of these prior traumatic experiences affected the ability of the family to function. And when someone has had a very difficult event, it affects their ability to connect with other people, and that can lead to trauma. I personally had a number of early life events that were quite traumatic. And then when I served in the military myself, I started from my earlier life events with a lot of dysregulation because, a lot of those things had never been healed. And I had an immense cognitive control to kind of hold it under, but there was a lot of dysregulation, so that while I was on active duty and deployed as a peacekeeper, it, as you said, undermined immunity and health. I was very sick during some of my time, and working with former warring factions in Bosnia, and then had an experience where I flatlined. And I left the military after that, and while I was in graduate school, and I was hyper-aroused. There is no getting around that. Insane insomnia and a variety of other symptoms. But I was doing 2 graduate programs. On the outside, I looked, very successful. Here I am at Harvard and MIT, holding it together. And my personal life was, just in a shambles because there were all these effects that I did not know how to deal with. And so I went to the doctor and was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and treated the way most Americans are treated. I was handed a bunch of pills. And the prescriptions actually led to symptom masking and further dysregulation. I tried a bunch of other things, and we'll talk a little bit about how that moved me towards developing the program I do now with the military. But again, trauma is a disordered inability to be in the here and now. And when I learned how to bring awareness, I could start a healing process, and have now moved towards sharing those skills because they are learnable, trainable skills that we can have to begin to regulate ourselves. I became a passion to share that with others.
Thank you, Liz. Paul.
I think that I was practicing living in the moment without realizing it for many times. And what I realized in the Army is we had to get rid of labels. And I realized this when I attended a funeral for a soldier that I had lost in Afghanistan. And I went there thinking, pay honor to his sacrifice. What I found was a young man who died and who never know what it feels like to hold his first child. And his mother really brought me into that moment to see that mothers, in this case, not soldiers, pay the price for our freedom. And I realized that in theater in Iraq when I had done a mission one night where we killed the enemy, but we created a bit of collateral damage and other civilians were killed. And it was a successful mission, a label that needed to be removed. It was the enemy was killed, but we also destroyed homes and we destroyed lives and we destroyed civilians, and that had to be addressed. And that ability to see that, and our soldiers were able to get from the violence to the build that had to follow if we were going to get past this wall, because especially in Iraq where we saw so many people not able to establish trust and move past the violence because they were just stuck in this traumatic moment. I don't think they lived the moment or recognized the moment to be able to move past it. And I saw this over and over again. Every time we'd come back from a deployment, we would see the young man buy a motorcycle and kill himself on the highway going 110 miles an hour. We would see a marriage go into serious domestic violence. We would see suicide rates. We would see all these things. But I also saw a good portion of soldiers that became stronger that were able to train faster, marriages were better, kids were doing well in school, and some of that were we hyperactive, and were we building resiliency? And I think that's what really got me into the study of the now, and then how can we build resiliency instead of just gamble on post-traumatic stress, where you're going to go, because we all, as I said earlier, we all suffer from it.
That's a perfect point. That now I'd like to pick that up and to talk about resiliency and to talk about what are some of the tools. But what I'd like to do is we have a number of questions here that have come in from Twitter as well as of our participants here. So I'm going to read some of them because I believe that some of the questions that are being raised will resonate with each of you. So when you're forming your answers to some of the tools, because we've been hearing all this difficult stuff, now, we're humans, we want to be optimistic. What can we do to build resilience, to take into account some of these questions? So I'm going to read 4 right now, and then we'll go back. One of them is from Twitter. Simone Weil argues that compassion, not rights, must be the basis of justice. Is the rule of law an interim step? So maybe one of you, where it relates to the tools that you're going to discuss, maybe Louise could take that one in your. I'll hand that to you to incorporate. Then there's another one from Twitter. Have your panelists found pre-existing points of local resilience in universities? What roles have students played? Is there someone whose work might touch upon that could incorporate that in your discussion of tools?
Mine.
No? Okay. Another one is from the Libyan Women Alliance participant who said, can you expand on how practical steps to inform political actors can positively shape the transformation of the collective identity of a nation? Beatrice, is that something you could address? Okay. And then another one is for the discussion. Have you seen, this is from a law student, have you seen any differences in the manifestation of trauma between men and women? Are there any gender-specific concerns that exist in your work? Can we, Liz? Okay.
Do that.
And then, actually I have 2 more. We talked about indigenous healing mechanisms in different cultures. How can we apply trauma healing models that are culturally and contextually based on a massive scale? For example, in the DRC. Okay. And then I'm going to pass one along to Walt, and he can choose how he addresses it.
Reading it?
I'll let him read it because Okay, and then the last one is, given the barrier trauma creates toward peace building and post-conflict democratic transition of the typical post-conflict, this was written by a lawyer, I know. It's long. Okay, of the typical post-conflict steps, elections, constitution making, institution building, security sector reform, justice sector reform, which, if any, would you defer until trauma is sufficiently addressed? Talks about the prioritization.
All of them.
I will give this to Louise. Okay. So why don't we start with Louise, and then we can.
Okay, compassion and timing. So one of the tools that I discovered is, you're going to hear some meditation techniques later. I'm also trained in meditation, but my natural response frequently in going into a traumatized situation was to close up, to get tight, to defend myself against the pain. I can't hear another story from a rape victim in the rape camps of Bosnia. I can't hear another story from the refugee camps of Rwanda. Because it's painful to hear, right? And so we tighten up. What I discovered is that the counterintuitive response is the best tool, which is to let the heart break. To literally let your heart break with the pain and not resist it, but accept it, receive it, experience it. And what I found is that more I let my heart break, it would break wider and wider open. And the more open my heart became, the more available I was to the flow of compassion and love. And the simple act of introducing compassion and love into a system, it doesn't change things magically overnight, but it becomes a seed. Because everyone, even the most traumatized human being, has a heart. Everyone has the capacity to love and to feel empathy and compassion for others who are hurting. And so what happens in traumatized systems is that everyone's heart is hardened. And only when you soften that the hardened heart can change happen. And that gets to the next issue of when do you do all of these wonderful things, all of these justice-oriented, law-oriented, systemic interventions. And I'll answer that by telling you my experience in Bosnia after the war, that the OSCE came to us. I was at the Institute for Multi-Track Diplomacy at the time, and they came to us scratching their heads, and they said, we went into Bosnia right after the war, and we did the bricks and mortar. We rebuilt the buildings, the houses, and then we set up the elections. And what we can't understand is why people aren't moving back into the houses, and why they aren't sending their kids back to school, and why they aren't really embracing democracy, because we gave them the structures. And they said, so we came to you because we think maybe you have a different approach. Could you maybe get people to talk to each other? So we went into Bosnia and started bringing people from the three ethnic groups together, and it was the first time they had a chance to talk to each other after the war. And what we found is that they could not yet talk about the traumatic events. It was too early. So what we did is we gave them an opportunity to talk metaphorically. So we literally, in the room, created a garden. Kind of a fake garden. But we walled off an area, and we, had plants there and soil and tools. And we said, so if you're approaching this garden, it's full of weeds, it's full of trash and debris, what would you do? And they were able to talk about what weeds they wanted to pull, what seeds they wanted to plant, how to prepare the soil for what would grow there next. And they could talk about their trauma and their situation metaphorically. They couldn't talk about it directly. And I don't think there's a set time. I don't think you can say, well, after 2 years or 10 years or 20 years. There are some people in Israel who still can't talk about it, about the Holocaust, So I don't know, and in fact, there's been some research done on Holocaust survivors, by the way, that showed, and this research was done some time ago, that showed that the healing of the Holocaust cannot happen in the lifetime of survivors. It will take many generations. So that doesn't mean you wait many generations before you introduce these systemic interventions, but it does mean that you pay attention to the fact that people may not be ready, or that some may be ready and others not, or in some parts of the country they're ready, in other parts they're not. And so you do it with a lot of participatory conversation, and with a lot of cross-sectoral and cross-cultural and cross-whatever the different factions are, dialogue, so that the trauma and the psychological impairment and woundedness gets to be part of the conversation.
Thank you. Elaine?
Yeah, if I had to name one tool, I think I would just say awareness, awareness, awareness of trauma. And it's particularly the awareness of the impact of trauma on our bodies, our brains, our behaviors, our relationships. And that's at the individual level, it's at the community level and societal levels. And so I think, ideally, if I were to answer that question, I would wish that all of those groups, people working in those areas, could have some kind of awareness, education, training about this before they go into it. But I think it's never too late. I think it always can be helpful. And I'm going to put a plug in here for STAR. I can't help but talk about this. The Trauma Awareness and Resilience program that we have, I I think it's been so helpful over these last 10 years to so many different cultures and peoples because it's a very integrated type of a model that lets people understand. It's educational, but it's experiential at the same time. And so it's not threatening. It's not like it's, I'm sick, I need help. It's like it's a learning experience, basically to help others, but in the process, people are helped themselves. As they understand sort of the victim experience, that what they experienced or what people experience is our normal reactions. They're not crazy. They're not sick. And then to be aware of how that unhealed trauma can very easily turn into the acting in, acting out behaviors that were mentioned earlier here, and that we literally, as individuals and societies, can just spin in those cycles for a long, long time. And then I think awareness of all the different tools that exist to break those cycles of violence and to heal this pain and these wounds are incredibly important. So it may be the individual there's all kinds of tools, whether it's meditation, whether it's tapping, whether it's different ways that we calm our mind, our brain, get it functioning again with the rational system, as the rational brain as well, or to release that trauma energy, or whether it's talking about conflict transformation processes or restorative justice processes. Those are all part of the trauma healing tools that are available out there for individuals and groups, and we need to be using all of them and connecting to all of them. So I think just awareness of that is a big part of it. I would just say there are on the table outside, there's some handouts on the trauma healing journey, breaking cycles of violence, that we use in the STAR program. It's informally called the snail model, in case anybody's interested, but that's sort of the basis of this awareness program and educational program. I'd like, if I could just say something about the question about indigenous healing mechanisms in different cultures. That is so true, and I think they exist everywhere. And part of what we've realized is by having a model that individuals and groups can put their story onto is really, really helpful. It's not like telling them, it invites and draws out those indigenous practices. It affirms them. It gives new ideas of other things that may exist that they haven't used or some they may want to try. But that's part of why I think it's been so effective and it's so useful. There's a lot more of the cultural indigenous stories I could tell, but I will pass for now.
Thank you, Beatrice.
Okay, well, I will pick up on that because part of my experience has been that beyond the appearance of, I always try to go beyond the appearance of chaos. You will often arrive in places and people tell you it's a chaos, and sometimes it really looks like a chaos and a no man's land, but my experience is always that you have to go beyond the appearances, and human beings have to survive, so we have to invent to be able to survive. I will say a few words about that later. Survival is not enough. Resilience is not survival, and survival mechanism can be counterproductive on a longer term. But resources exist in any society. The thing is to find them. It's not always easy, and it's not perfect. And I will not have time, but will be happy if there are questions to go back to that. There are conditions for them to work, and we should not be romantic about them either. They may be tainted. There are many issues out there. So they are not perfect. We know now more or less the conditions for them to be able to function in a society, and how to, like in the case of DRC, where it's almost a continent. But it's true for many, even because, for instance, Haiti is a very small country, but what works in the north doesn't work in the south. So it's pretty common, actually, that mechanisms are very local. If they work, they're very localized. So that means that you need a bottom-up process, always. You need to start from diversity and look at what's working locally. And then you need dialogue. That's something that everybody has stressed. You need dialogue between actors in society. You need dialogue between insider and outsider. And for me, the role of outsiders is really to facilitate and empower people to find their own resources and find the way they want to answer them. What I wanted to, and another aspect of that, and and also it comes from personal experience, is that traditional approaches are never enough, including to capture and face a certain number of traumas. So I just want to say, beyond the example that Louise mentioned before of this healing processes in Sierra Leone, that we have been able to document similar examples in quite a number of countries now. And they are usually very complex rituals. Sometimes they last for days. They are not necessarily traditional the way we understand. We have a lot of examples of hybrid, which means that it's a mix of so-called traditional and modern. And honestly, tradition, contrary to what we think, is reinvented all the time. I think that the basic function of a tradition is keeps, if it's alive, it's reinvented. So you will find a mix of, traditional religions and modern religion in Guatemala and Peru. In Cambodia, it's the way they have dealt with trauma is really a mix of modern therapeutic approaches and very traditional, using traditional healers. So you have a lot of mixed. Another very important dimension of those indigenous mechanism, and that's where they are very interesting, is that they usually articulate different functions. They usually don't give only one answer, which is usually what our more conventional answers give. What I mean by that is, and just briefly, the four main functions we have found for across all those different type of mechanism, across very different cultures, is first, one very interesting thing is that they articulate the individual and the community. So the narrative, the individual narrative, is re-articulated with a community narrative and a collective narrative. And it gives space to the individual trauma to be heard, to be recognized. So for instance, in all cases of stigmatization, for rapes, even for perpetrators, I've seen very emotional, touching scenes where perpetrators would be crying, saying that the first time, while they were in the process where they will be judged, because that's an aspect of the ritual, but their story and their suffering will be acknowledged. Yes, we recognize that you have suffered and you are suffering. And that's an important aspect. Another aspect is one function of those rituals usually is to reintegrate and trust and reestablish some kind of trust. So to retell the collective rules, to retell that was wrong, for instance. In different ways, very often it's said, what happened was wrong. It's not acceptable, it's not possible, and now are the rules. And by the way, it's crucial for kids. It's crucial for child soldiers, and they demand that. Very often, I've had child soldiers coming to me and saying, those programs that you white people are putting into place, you want me to become an adult again. I want to be a child. And usually those rituals put them back in a situation of being a child and having to follow rules. Another third aspect of those rituals that sometimes we miss in our, in the toolbox we have about peace building, we mix the meaning. We miss of the way we tell the meaning of what peace is about what this transition is about. We miss the irrational and in the imaginary, the way those representations, those moral values play in the way we look at the transition from violence to nonviolence, for instance. So ritualizing, there was a question about the role of politicians, thinking of rituals at the political level is very important. How you ritualize a transition for society, how you ritualize where you are now and what you want to build with important symbols is very, very important. And finally, those mechanisms usually fulfill a large number of functions. So they integrate, for instance, most of them usually integrate the trauma aspect and the justice aspect. And why, to answer one of the questions that was asked, is because justice, we tend to think about punitive aspect, but justice is also about restorative justice. It's about restoring trust among people. It's about restoring trust by citizens that the rules are going to be, that there are rules and they are going to be followed by everybody. So this restorative dimension is very important, and that's a direct contribution to trauma healing. This whole side, and there are many aspects of that. I have not time to go into that, but that's very important. The last 2 points I want to make very briefly is, as I said, survival is not resilience. And resilience is a very concrete definition and very concrete dimensions into it, and I think it's important not to confuse the two. And resilience is about a very dynamic process. It's not about putting a cover on something or blocking something to change. Resilience is possible if you think about a transition or peace building as a process, and as supporting a change, as supporting a transformation. Society can transition if you transform, if you help change. It's not about we block, violence is enough. No, it's about how you change positively, peacefully. And that's very important, including for the trauma healing. The last point about how political actors can positively shape the transformation of the collective identity of a nation. There will be multiple things to say, and there is no one answer. There's a large variety in history and memorialization of things that can be done and the role that political actors can play into that. Among the important things, because they walk generally a very fine line. Their role is very difficult, is very crucial and very difficult in a transition. Because on one side, they can block things or they can allow a lot of things to happen. And to give you just an example, it can be as stupid, so to speak, as to choose where you are going to put a monument or how you are going to involve people to build a monument to the victims. Few answers to that. One, awareness. Training your leaders about what trauma, and it can be very brief, but what trauma is about, and realizing what it is about and what are the challenges for the society as a large. Two, processes. More than the content of what you do, how you do it is absolutely crucial. As I mentioned, for the case of GSC, for instance, you have to start from diversity. People have very different experience of violence of the war, even in a single city. I know you know that, for instance, in Libya, even in one city from one block to the next, people have a different experience of what has happened. The trauma is different, and you cannot go around the fact that history is subjective. Each personal story is important, has to be integrated. So you have to find the way, and every society has that. Go through mechanism, existing networks, the large array of organizations you have and mechanism to hear people, to create space so that this diversity can be heard and answers can be found on the ground. And you go up, not the reverse. So the role of political actors is to hear and go in the field, in the ground, and go up. But there are ways, and there's a large, we have now a lot of experience that give you different examples and different ideas of what can be done. But awareness, hearing the diversity, process, participatory process, and bottom-up perspective can really help. And it's visible and feasible, and it doesn't take off your hands power or your role. It gives you more power, actually, and more leverage to actually facilitate a process. Because in every society, that's the bottom line, there is a lot of creativity, even with traumatized people. The problem is the way we deal with transition. Very often we block that creativity instead of allowing it to go up.
Thank you, Beatrice. And I'm going to actually add two more questions for Liz and Walt. One is, people will talk about addiction treatment starts with an acknowledgement of powerlessness. Are there any parallels in treating severe, complex trauma, that foundation or that type of a triggering point? And then also, Walt, to touch upon, this question came from someone with the National Judicial Institute, Nigeria. How do you build back trust in a community that is experiencing violence, thereby leading to trauma, especially if dialogue is not foreseeable? So I thought that in the military context, how one does that when you can't just call everybody together and have a dialogue with that community. I mean, you can, but it's not always an easy move. So I'm going to put those down to YouTube.
So I'd like to, in some ways, what I have to say is complementary to what Louise and Elaine and Beatrice have just shared. You've been sharing much more at the social and societal level. I actually think societal resilience comes from individual resilience, and the work that we have done has focused very much at resilience at an individual level. And I'm going to define resilience as the ability to be functioning effectively during stressful experience, even incredibly traumatic experience, and then also being able to recover back to a baseline after that experience is over. And for most of us, when we experience trauma, we don't fully have that recovery piece. Trauma gets encoded in our memory very differently than other memory. Trauma is encoded in our implicit memory. And when we have had a stressful experience and the body experiences fight or flight response, if we have a very, very high reaction and the organism at the survival brain level, this is implicit, unconscious level, if our organism perceives that fleeing or fighting, both of those are not possible, we can end up in a state called freeze and dissociate. Any of these three responses, fight response, flight response, or freeze response, there's a lot of energy mobilized in the system to handle that threat. And if we haven't completely discharged that energy, we will end up dysregulated over time and symptomatic. This is not a case of mental weakness. This is a case of our organism having become dysregulated. And although we've been talking about awareness, there's a different kind of level of awareness that I'd like to mention, both awareness and understanding of the effects of trauma, but there's also awareness of the way this dysregulation is showing up in our bodies and minds. And we can train our minds to pay attention moment by moment to what's happening. We don't need to necessarily go back to the story because the explicit memory often has a very fragmented or distorted understanding of the story anyway. Remember, the trauma is stored in this implicit way, and it's a very overcoupled capsule that includes sights and sounds and smells and emotions and body sensations and thoughts, and any piece of that can trigger the cue. And when that happens, again, the survival brain, not the thinking brain making rational choice, the survival brain will then have a response that may be quite irrational or even harmful, counterproductive to what you're trying to do in the present. So the way we can actually heal this is at a very micro level by bringing awareness, noticing what's happening while it's happening, bringing that kind of mindful awareness to our experience. And I've designed a training that we use with soldiers and Marines and others in high-stress contexts. It's called Mindfulness-Based Mind Fitness Training. And we have done now 3 neuroscience studies of this training with pre-deployment soldiers and Marines, and have shown pretty remarkable effects in terms of changes in their brain functioning and changes in their biology, in their physical resilience, their capacity to tolerate and operate effectively in stressful environments and recover back to baseline. And it all comes down to being able to bring awareness, mindful awareness, moment by moment to our experience. We don't necessarily have to go back to the story. Remember, the implicit memory it includes all of those sensations in the body, all of that activation. And when we can bring mindful awareness and help use the thinking brain as an ally to the survival brain, so using the thinking brain's conscious control of attention, where you're directing your attention to help the body and mind feel grounded and safe, it actually allows the survival brain to begin to reset, and it supports the natural regulation process that needs to happen. Resilience is not about being pampered. We grow our tolerance to operating in difficult environments by having experiences that take us out of our comfort zone and then fully recovering back to it. And so this mindfulness-based mind fitness training can kind of complement the incredible stressors that men and women are dealing with both in the pre-deployment training and then also while they're deployed, but then providing the skills, and these are really very practicable, exercisable skills that we can develop competence with, develop that over time to really help the body and mind recover.
And I'm reminded of a lot of the new studies that are coming out, yours and many others, that talk about the science of it.
Absolutely.
It's starting to demystify something that people
Yes.
might have noticed themselves through awareness, but now they're seeing through enhanced brain imaging, we're starting to see the science finally, and I think
Yes.
that's going to open up in a large way to understand the human mechanism through that.
Yes, we've seen changes in brain functioning after 8 weeks of this training. We've seen changes in biology in terms of their stress response from blood. I mean, it's very obvious that we can, at a very micro level, begin to regulate. And bringing that kind of regulation and return to the present moment then allows the kinds of other societal healing that needs to happen too. So do we have time for me to handle these questions?
We do, because we have technically 5 minutes, but with everyone's indulgence, we will have a break. There's coffee and little finger things to just go over a few minutes, because we started just a little bit late, if that's okay. And then we'll get everybody. But I want to make sure that we conclude everyone's questions that came in from Twitter and through the... Okay, great.
So in terms of differences in the manifestation of trauma between men and women, men tend towards dysregulation from fight response that was inhibited, and so they might tend towards more acting out behavior, more emotions on the rage, irritation to rage spectrum, and will tend sometimes more towards hyper arousal. Women will tend more towards the fear spectrum, so from anxiety to panic, and tend also often towards hypoarousal, that fatigue and depression. But this dysregulation happens for both genders, and it can manifest in any way. Those are just general tendencies. And in terms of specific concerns with gender, our body and mind, the survival brain, and then the nervous system that actually is enacting this, we perceive something as stressful when it is unpredictable. When we perceive it as unpredictable, we perceive it as uncontrollable, and we perceive it as novel. And a lot of military training is to try and help habituate you so that things don't feel quite as novel and unpredictable and uncontrollable. Because of cultural ways that men and women are treated, there are often situations where women are culturally tuned towards not feeling as much in control or not feeling, and so they might have more effective stressors in that regard too. So that would be the way I'd answer that question. The question about addiction treatment starting with this acknowledgement of powerlessness, there is a parallel in that you need to start with an acknowledgement, but I don't think the acknowledgement here is of powerlessness. I think the acknowledgement here is of this isn't a place of weakness. This is a body, mind, heart system that is not operating the way it was designed to operate, and that we need to be using particular skills and particular support networks to help with that support process. So if it's an acknowledgement that things are not exactly right now, and we need to now be taking steps to help change that. But it isn't powerless. We have, in any moment, the opportunity to bring mindful awareness in the here and now. And when we are fully in the present, here and now, by definition, we're not fully caught in the past. And any healing of trauma involves having some foot in the past, being aware of that event, but the transformation happens in this present moment, and that's not powerless at all.
Thank you. Walt.
I'll address these really quickly. The one, it says potentially sensitive subject, and it's a question in relation to the U.S. servicemen accused of killing civilians in Afghanistan, and the question is, do we believe that this act was trauma-induced, and if so, should it mitigate or remove guilt in a court of law? I can't speak to this case. I've learned a long time ago. I will not speculate on other actions in combat unless I was physically there, and I know nothing about this one. But I had a case happened in a unit I commanded. We were 3 days away from leaving Iraq. A young medic picked up a gun, was delusional, and wanted to apprehend a vehicle, and it was just two civilian contractors working on a base, and he killed one of them. And then he almost killed himself. We saved him. We didn't see the signs, but he had been deployed many times, lost many of his friends that he was trying to save. And what I would say is that I'm not a lawyer, but we need to let the science of into the rule of law because there is a good science behind it. In the Army, as Liz mentioned, we have done exercises for years to keep our bodies physically in shape. We're just now learning that we need to do the same exercises for our mind to get them mentally prepared for the stressors we're going to face and live in often on a daily basis. So I'm happy to report that if you could see my brain, I'm ready for swimsuit season. But on the other one, on how do we build trust when, build back trust when you can't get a dialogue. I would say my field experience, I would say that gender does make a difference. I have found females so much more capable of building back quicker. My best political leaders in Iraq and the province that I served in were the female elected officials because I think in my perspective was because they didn't mislabel. They recognized the violence and the trauma. They dealt with what happened. They didn't put it in some place or mislabel it or make an excuse for it. They dealt with it and moved on. And one of our best community leaders was the Dean of Biology and Chemistry at Tikrit University. And although she was my largest critic, she really taught me that you can build back. And I always taught our soldiers that compassion is stronger than bullets, and that you need to, if you want to build trust, you must first extend trust. And I think that's in part of peace building that it's hard to do, especially if you've experienced the trauma and you've seen the violence. Trust is the last thing you want to give away, and it's the very first thing you must if you're going to build it. And I hope that addresses that question, and I really did not want to avoid that sensitive subject. I just really have no information on it. But too often it's sad, and you realize that these soldiers are your responsibility. I felt responsible for the soldier that committed that act, and I felt responsible for also the lives that were lost. And we have to recognize we put our soldiers in these situations, and not just the soldiers, but the civilians and everyone who lives in Iraq and Afghanistan, and Bosnia, Kosovo, and Central America, all the places that I've been, everyone is affected, and it has to be taken into account.
Thank you, Walt, for bringing us back full circle to the beginning through your comments. And I want to thank the panelists for all of your wealth of knowledge and sharing all of your experiences. And what I'd like to do now is I have a few more thanks, but I need to walk over here because my card is there. I also want to thank the helping hands because running around up and down the stairs getting exercise and welcoming everybody, we have an incredible number of staff members here, and without their assistance, none of this would be possible. So I want to personally thank Sophie Grumlon, Amanda Mayerl, Rebecca Coleman, Kim Feinstein, Brooke Stedman, Cheryl Saverstein, Wesley Horn, Asia Fontan, Anil Varghese, Karima Taufik, and the person who helped write this didn't write his name. He's in my department, Vijay Simhan, who helped put together with Audrey the slideshow that you saw of the photos from our travels, the Rule of Law Center's travels around the country in various situations. So I wanted to also thank him. So thank you for your attention. Thank you to everyone who's watching by webcast, and thanks for the wonderful questions. And again, thank you to our panelists. And we are going to look forward after the break to our guest from Libya and our honorary Libyan who works in Libya to come up and share the personal experiences. So to bring what a lot of our panelists here were talking about to a country's experiences. So I believe we have 20 minutes, is that right? 11 to 11:20? Okay, great, thank you.